The CNN studio lights beamed down on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett as she sat composed in her navy blue blazer, microphone clipped to her lapel. Across from her, legendary Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz leaned forward in his chair, his signature bow tie perfectly centered, his face turning increasingly red as the interview progressed. "Congresswoman Crockett doesn't understand the Constitution." Dershowitz suddenly erupted, pointing his finger directly at her. "She's completely misrepresenting the law and misleading the American people." The studio audience gasped. The moderator's eyes widened. The production crew zoomed in on Crockett's face, expecting shock or intimidation from this brutal attack by one of America's most famous legal minds. But Congresswoman Crockett didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm as she reached for a folder beside her chair. The studio fell silent as she opened it, revealing what appeared to be highlighted legal documents. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I've been waiting for you to say exactly that." The tension in the studio was electric. Dershowitz's smug expression froze as Crockett pulled out what looked like Supreme Court decisions and his own past writings. Within seconds, she was about to deliver a response that would leave America's most famous legal commentators speechless on live television. Before diving deeper into this stunning confrontation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more political showdowns that expose the truth. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when powerful figures get called out on their hypocrisy. Alan Dershowitz sat confidently in the CNN studio, his decades of experience as Harvard Law's youngest full professor evident in his posture. At 85, his reputation preceded him. Defender of O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, and Donald Trump during his first impeachment trial. His books lined law school shelves across America, and his opinions on constitutional law had shaped legal discourse for generations. "Thank you for having me," Dershowitz said to moderator Anderson Cooper. "I'm here because I believe we need to defend constitutional principles regardless of political party." The camera panned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising Democratic star from Texas' 30th District. At 43, Crockett represented a new generation of leadership, a former public defender and civil rights attorney who had rapidly ascended from the Texas State House to the U.S. Congress in just 3 years. "It's interesting to hear Professor Dershowitz talk about principles," Crockett said calmly. "I've studied his earlier work extensively." Behind the scenes, Crockett's team had prepared meticulously for this moment. Her chief of staff, Marcus Washington, had compiled a thick folder of Dershowitz's contradictory statements over the years. "He's going to try to lecture you about the law," Washington had warned during prep. "He always does this to black women legislators. Be ready." Crockett nodded, reviewing the materials. As a civil rights attorney who had fought Texas voter suppression laws and represented protesters during the George Floyd demonstrations, she was no stranger to confronting powerful figures. The stakes were high. This wasn't just a theoretical legal debate. It centered on constitutional challenges to recent voting rights legislation that Crockett had co-sponsored. Dershowitz had published an op-ed the previous week calling the bill dangerously unconstitutional and suggesting its supporters were constitutionally illiterate. "Let me be clear," Dershowitz began, his voice rising slightly. "I've defended the Constitution for over 50 years through Republican and Democratic administrations. This isn't partisan for me." Cooper turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your response?" "Professor Dershowitz has indeed had a long career," Crockett replied, her Texas accent subtle but present. "That's exactly what concerns me. The length of that career has produced quite a paper trail." Dershowitz shifted in his seat, seemingly caught off guard by her confidence. He had expected deference, perhaps even intimidation. Instead, Crockett's composed demeanor suggested she had come armed with something specific. Off camera, the show's producer whispered to an assistant, "She's not backing down." This is about to get good. The audience could feel it too. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as clips of the opening exchange hit Twitter. Liberal viewers, long frustrated with Dershowitz's evolution from civil liberties champion to Trump defender, sensed Crockett was about to say what many had been thinking for years. Conservative viewers, meanwhile, prepared to defend Dershowitz, a man they now embraced despite having vilified him during the O.J. Simpson trial decades earlier. "Congresswoman," Cooper continued, "Professor Dershowitz has specifically criticized Section 5 of your voting rights bill as unconstitutional. Your response?" Crockett nodded, opening her folder deliberately. I'd be happy to address that. But first, I think we need to establish whether Professor Dershowitz's current constitutional interpretation is consistent with his previous positions. Dershowitz's expression tightened. This wasn't the direction he had expected. The red light on camera 1 indicated they were about to return from commercial break. The confrontation that would soon explode across social media was about to begin in earnest. Anderson Cooper reopened the segment with a quick summary. We're back with Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett discussing constitutional challenges to the new voting rights legislation. Dershowitz didn't wait for a question. Congressman Crockett's bill undermines state authority over elections, violating Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. It's federal overreach, plain and simple, Crockett calmly replied. The Elections Clause you're referencing actually gives Congress explicit authority to make or alter state election regulations. That's directly in the text, Professor. You're misreading it, Dershowitz interrupted, his voice rising. The framers never intended the framers' intentions? Crockett raised an eyebrow. Interesting you should mention that. The studio grew tense. Cooper, sensing the shift, leaned back slightly. Your interpretation today directly contradicts your published work from 2005, Crockett continued, pulling a highlighted book from her folder. In Rights from Wrongs, page 163, you wrote, Congress has broad authority under the Elections Clause to establish federal standards for national elections, even when these standards override state preferences. Dershowitz's face flushed. That was a different context, was it? Crockett asked, her voice remaining steady. Or has your constitutional interpretation shifted with political convenience? Dershowitz straightened his bow tie, visibly agitated. How dare you question my integrity? I've been teaching constitutional law since before you were born, and that's precisely why your inconsistency is so troubling, Crockett responded. Your experience makes these contradictions impossible to dismiss as simple mistakes. Cooper attempted to regain control. Professor Dershowitz, how do you respond to the apparent contradiction? There's no contradiction, Dershowitz snapped. The Congresswoman is cherry-picking quotes without understanding nuance. This is what happens when politicians without sufficient legal background try to interpret constitutional law. The personal attack hung in the air. Studio staff exchanged glances. This had crossed from debate into something more hostile. Crockett's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Let's address my qualifications, since you brought them up. With all due respect, Dershowitz continued, talking over her, I've argued before the Supreme Court numerous times. I've written definitive books on constitutional interpretation, and frankly, I'm tired of being lectured by someone who... Someone who what, Professor? Crockett interjected, her calm voice cutting through his tirade. Someone who graduated cum laude from law school? Someone who practiced constitutional law for 15 years before entering politics? Or perhaps you meant someone who successfully argued before the Fifth Circuit multiple times. Yep. The studio fell silent. Cooper, sensing the mounting tension, attempted to redirect. Let's focus on the specific legal questions. No, Anderson. Dershowitz interrupted again, his voice now dripping with condescension. This is important. The Congresswoman represents a dangerous trend of progressive politicians who disregard constitutional limitations when inconvenient. She's part of a movement that's fundamentally transforming America against the founders' vision. Crockett shook her head slightly, opening another folder. Speaking of transformations, Professor, let's discuss your own. In 2016, you wrote that Donald Trump represents a clear and present danger to constitutional democracy. By 2020, you were defending him during impeachment, arguing that presidents cannot be impeached for actions they believe will help their re-election. Dershowitz's face reddened further. My impeachment argument was misrepresented by the media. What I actually said was... I have the transcript right here, Crockett said, holding up a document. January 29, 2020, on the Senate floor. If a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Those were your exact words. The tension in the studio was palpable. Production assistants were frantically sharing clips on social media, where the exchange was already trending. Dershowitz Crockett had begun climbing Twitter's trending topics. Cooper attempted once more to redirect the conversation. Let's return to the voting rights bill specifically. The bill is unconstitutional, Dershowitz declared flatly, and Congresswoman Crockett knows it. She's playing political games while undermining our constitutional order. This is exactly what I warned about in my recent Wall Street Journal op-ed. That op-ed, Crockett nodded, where you called me and my colleagues constitutionally illiterate. Is that correct? I stand by that assessment, Dershowitz said, doubling down. Your bill demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of federalism and separation of powers. It's constitutional malpractice. The personal attack hung in the air. Cooper winced slightly, knowing this had escalated beyond the usual CNN debate format. Crockett took a deep breath, looking directly at Dershowitz. Professor, I've listened patiently to your attacks on my intelligence, my qualifications, and my understanding of the Constitution, and I've noticed something interesting. What's that? Dershowitz asked, his tone dismissive. You've spent our entire segment attacking me personally rather than addressing the specific provisions of the bill, Crockett observed. It's a classic technique when someone doesn't have a substantive argument. Dershowitz's expression darkened. That's absurd. I've written extensively on why this bill violates Article 1, Section 4, Crockett finished his sentence. The same clause you previously argued gave Congress broad authority? Or perhaps you'd prefer to discuss the 14th and 15th Amendments, which explicitly empower Congress to protect voting rights regardless of state preferences? Cooper, sensing a breaking point, interjected. We'll need to take a quick break. When we return, we'll dive deeper into the specific constitutional questions surrounding this legislation. As the cameras cut away, Dershowitz turned to his aide, visibly shaken. Get me everything we have on her legal background, now. Across the studio, Crockett remained composed, reviewing her notes as a makeup artist touched up her appearance. Her communications director whispered, "You've got him on the ropes." Crockett simply nodded. We haven't even gotten to the main event yet. Social media was exploding with reactions. Conservative accounts claimed Dershowitz was teaching her a lesson, while progressive accounts celebrated Crockett for not backing down to bullying. The next segment promised to be even more intense as both prepared their strongest arguments. The confrontation was about to reach its climax after the commercial break. As the cameras went live again, the tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Anderson Cooper wasted no time diving back in. Professor Dershowitz, you were about to respond to Congresswoman Crockett's points about constitutional interpretation. Dershowitz leaned forward, composing himself. Yes. Let me be perfectly clear. The Congresswoman is engaging in selective quotation and misrepresentation. Context matters in constitutional law. My position has always been consistent. Federal power over state elections exists, but is limited. He turned directly to Crockett, finger-pointing. Your bill crosses those limits egregiously. It mandates specific voting hours, prohibits common-sense ID requirements, and federalizes procedures that have always been left to states. It's an unconstitutional power grab, and as a lawyer, you should know better. The personal attack was deliberate, designed to provoke an emotional response, but Crockett remained unruffled. Professor, she began calmly, I've been patient with your condescension, but it's time for some clarity. She opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents. You mentioned ID requirements. In 2008, you wrote in the Boston Globe that voter ID laws disproportionately burden minority voters without meaningfully preventing fraud. You called such laws solutions in search of a problem. That's a direct quote. Dershowitz shifted uncomfortably. The evidence has evolved since then. Has it? Crockett interrupted, her voice still measured but now taking control. Because federal courts have consistently found minimal evidence of in-person voter fraud. What seems to have evolved is not the evidence but your position after changing political affiliations. She turned to face the camera. But this isn't just about policy disagreements. This is about intellectual honesty. Dershowitz's face flushed deeper. How dare you question? I dare because consistency matters in constitutional interpretation, Crockett continued, not allowing the interruption. And your inconsistency reveals something important about your attacks on me and this legislation. She pulled out another document. This is your Harvard Law Review article from 1992, where you argued that voting is a fundamental right deserving the highest level of federal protection. You specifically advocated for Congress to set national standards for ballot access. Crockett looked directly at Dershowitz. What changed, Professor? The Constitution hasn't been amended regarding elections since you wrote that. The only thing that's changed is who would benefit from federal protection of voting rights. The studio fell completely silent. Even Cooper seemed momentarily stunned by the precision of her challenge. Dershowitz attempted to regain control. "You're oversimplifying complex legal arguments." "Am I?" Crockett reached for one final document. "Then let me be very specific. In your 2005 testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, you stated, Congress not only has the power but the duty to ensure that state election procedures don't disenfranchise eligible voters. You specifically advocated for federal legislation setting minimum early voting periods, limiting wait times, and standardizing ID requirements." She held up the transcript. "All provisions nearly identical to those in my bill that you now call unconstitutional." Dershowitz's expression froze. The camera caught his momentary look of panic as he realized she had receipts for everything. "That was a different political context?" he stammered. "The Constitution doesn't change based on political context, Professor," Crockett replied, her voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew she had won. "That's your position now, isn't it? That's what you've been arguing on Fox News for the past 5 years?" She turned to Cooper. "Henderson, I didn't come here to engage in personal attacks. I came to discuss constitutional principles. But when someone of Professor Dershowitz's stature calls elected officials constitutionally illiterate while contradicting his own long-established legal positions, it matters. It matters because millions of Americans rely on legal experts to interpret our founding document honestly." The camera caught Dershowitz loosening his bow tie slightly, visibly uncomfortable. "Congressman," Cooper asked, "what do you say to the criticism that your bill federalizes what has traditionally been state domain?" "I'd say that tradition isn't the same as constitutional requirement," Crockett responded confidently. "The Elections Clause explicitly gives Congress the power to make or alter state election regulations. The 14th and 15th Amendments further empower federal protection of voting rights. These aren't radical interpretations. They're directly from the text." She glanced at Dershowitz. "In fact, they're interpretations that Professor Dershowitz himself championed throughout most of his career. His recent reversal doesn't change the constitutional text or 2 centuries of Supreme Court precedent." Dershowitz attempted one final counterattack. "Your mischaracterization of my positions is disappointing. I've always believed in constitutional consistency regardless of—" "Then perhaps you can explain this," Crockett interjected, holding up side-by-side quotes from Dershowitz. "In 2015, you wrote that presidents can absolutely be impeached for abuse of power even without committing crimes. In 2020, you argued the exact opposite during President Trump's impeachment." She set down the paper gently. "Professor, with all due respect, this isn't about me mischaracterizing your positions. This is about you contradicting yourself based on who's in power." The moment landed like a thunderclap. Social media was erupting. The video clip of this exchange was already being shared thousands of times, with comments like, "Dershowitz demolished," and "Crockett brought receipts." Cooper, recognizing the significance of what had just transpired, turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, how do you respond to these apparent contradictions in your positions?" Dershowitz, visibly rattled, attempted to regain composure. "Constitutional interpretation is nuanced. My core principles remain consistent, even if specific applications have evolved with new information." "New information about what the Constitution says?" Crockett asked innocently. The question hung in the air unanswered. Dershowitz's legendary quick responses failed him. For perhaps the first time in his 60-year career, Alan Dershowitz appeared to be speechless on television. Crockett continued, her voice now gentle but firm. "Professor, I actually have immense respect for your earlier work. Your contributions to civil liberties law are significant. That's precisely why your recent contradictions are so disappointing. The Constitution deserves better. The American people deserve better." The tone shift from confrontation to almost compassionate criticism was devastating. Dershowitz appeared not just defeated, but diminished. Cooper, sensing the moment, turned to the camera. "We need to take another break. When we come back, final thoughts from Professor Dershowitz and Congresswoman Crockett on the future of voting rights legislation." As the cameras cut away, The studio erupted in whispered conversations. Production assistants were frantically clipping the exchange for social media, knowing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Dershowitz sat motionless, staring at his notes. Across the studio, Crockett calmly took a sip of water, her expression revealing nothing of the seismic victory she had just achieved. When the CNN cameras returned from commercial, the dynamic in the studio had visibly shifted. Alan Dershowitz, legendary for his verbal confidence, sat slightly slumped in his chair. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, her folder of receipts neatly arranged before her. "We're back with Professor Alan Dershowitz and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," Anderson Cooper said. "Professor, your final thoughts on this debate?" Dershowitz attempted to salvage his position. "While I appreciate the Congresswoman's passion, I stand by my assessment that this legislation overreaches constitutional boundaries. Selective quotation doesn't change the fundamental principles of federalism." His voice lacked the certainty from earlier. The damage had been done. Cooper turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your closing thoughts?" "The Constitution isn't partisan," Crockett stated simply. "It doesn't change based on who's in power. My bill reflects long-standing constitutional principles that Professor Dershowitz himself once defended. Americans deserve consistent constitutional interpretation, especially from our most prominent legal minds." She closed her folder deliberately. "I invite everyone watching to read the bill for themselves, read the Constitution, and make their own judgments. The right to vote is fundamental to our democracy, and protecting it shouldn't be controversial." As the segment ended, the real explosion was just beginning. Within minutes, Crockett receipts brought and Dershowitz shut down were trending nationally. The clip of Crockett methodically exposing Dershowitz's contradictions spread across platforms with unprecedented speed. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow opened her show that evening with, "Tonight we witnessed something remarkable. Masterclass in constitutional accountability delivered by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to none other than Alan Dershowitz." The Washington Post published an analysis within hours. Crockett-Dershowitz exchange exposes the partisan evolution of constitutional originalism. Conservative media scrambled to defend Dershowitz. Fox News host Laura Ingraham claimed Crockett ambushed a respected legal scholar with out-of-context quotes spanning decades. But the damage control proved difficult even in friendly territory. When Dershowitz appeared on Fox and Friends the following morning, host Steve Doocy asked uncomfortable questions. "Professor, how do you explain the apparent contradictions Congresswoman Crockett highlighted yesterday?" Dershowitz appeared flustered. "My positions have evolved based on deeper constitutional understanding." "But the Constitution hasn't changed," Doocy noted, surprising viewers with the follow-up. On Capitol Hill, the exchange transformed Crockett overnight. Senior Democratic leadership invited her to strategy meetings on the voting rights bill. Progressive representatives wore receipts, brought pins in solidarity. Republican lawmakers, previously dismissive of Crockett as a freshman legislator, now approached her voting rights bill with new caution. Senator Josh Hawley, scheduled to attack the bill on similar constitutional grounds, quietly canceled his press conference. President Biden referenced the exchange in his weekly address. "As we saw in that powerful moment on CNN, our Constitution empowers Congress to protect voting rights. It always has." Constitutional law professors incorporated the exchange into their curriculum. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 30 years of teaching constitutional law, I've rarely seen a more effective demonstration of principled legal reasoning defeating opportunistic constitutional interpretation." Law students across the country created memes. One viral image showed Dershowitz's face with the caption, "When you realize she's read everything you've ever written." For Crockett, the aftermath brought both opportunity and challenges. Her social media following tripled overnight. Interview requests flooded her office. The Texas Tribune ran a profile from Houston public defender to constitutional defender, Jasmine Crockett's rise. Progressive donors quadrupled their contributions to her re-election campaign. MoveOn.org launched a Defend Democracy Like Crockett fundraising campaign that raised $3.00. 2 million in 48 hours for voting rights initiatives. But with visibility came scrutiny. Conservative opposition researchers dug into her past. Right-wing media highlighted her defense of Black Lives Matter protesters, framing her as radical and anti-police. Death threats necessitated enhanced security for her district offices. Her chief of staff implemented new protocols for screening mail after receiving suspicious packages. None of this deterred Crockett. 3 days after the CNN appearance, she addressed the Congressional Black Caucus. "They're coming after me because we exposed the game." For too long, certain legal scholars have pretended constitutional interpretation is objective while conveniently changing their positions based on who benefits, and her colleagues gave her a standing ovation. For Dershowitz, the fallout was severe. Harvard law students circulated a petition questioning his emeritus status. Publishers reconsidered planned books. Speaking engagements were canceled. His decades-long reputation for brilliant legal analysis, regardless of one's opinion on his conclusions, now carried an asterisk. Law review articles began referencing the pre- and post-political evolution Dershowitz, treating his work as two distinct legal philosophies. Media outlets ran retrospectives, examining his journey from civil liberties champion to partisan defender. The New Yorker published a lengthy profile titled The Dershowitz Contradiction, America's Legal Chameleon. Most significantly, the exchange shifted the national conversation around voting rights. Constitutional arguments against federal protection weakened when their most prominent champion had been so thoroughly exposed for inconsistency. Public support for the voting rights bill increased by 12 points in polling conducted the week after the CNN segment. Moderate Democratic senators, previously hesitant, signaled new openness to supporting the legislation. 3 weeks later, when the bill reached the Senate floor, Vice President Kamala Harris presided over the session, wearing a subtle lapel pin that insiders recognized as Crockett's signature accessory from the CNN appearance. The parliamentary proceedings were interrupted when Republican Senator Ted Cruz raised constitutional objections, similar to Dershowitz's argument. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar responded simply by reading Dershowitz's 1992 Harvard Law Review article supporting federal voting protections, then yielding her time. The gallery erupted in knowing laughter. In her district office in Dallas, Crockett watched the Senate debate on C-SPAN, surrounded by her staff. When the final vote tally showed the bill passing 52-48 with 2 Republican crossovers, spontaneous applause broke out. Her communications director handed her a phone. "Madam Speaker wants to speak with you." As Crockett took the call, her legislative director whispered to colleagues, "History books will show this bill passed because one Congresswoman came prepared with receipts." The ultimate vindication came 6 months later. When challenges to the voting rights law reached the Supreme Court, legal observers were shocked when the 6-3 conservative majority upheld the core provisions. Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion cited the Elections Clause, an historical precedent for federal protection of voting rights. Most notably, the opinion quoted from Dershowitz's early scholarly work supporting congressional authority, the very quotes Crockett had highlighted in the CNN exchange. Legal analysts called it the Crockett effect, the impact of exposing inconsistent constitutional interpretation so effectively that even ideologically opposed jurists had to acknowledge the weakness of opportunistic legal arguments. On the 1-year anniversary of the CNN appearance, Dershowitz published a reflective op-ed in The Atlantic, "When I Was Wrong, a Legal Scholar's Reckoning with Inconsistency." While not specifically mentioning Crockett, the timing spoke volumes. The exchange entered the pantheon of political confrontation lore alongside moments like Lloyd Benson's "You're no Jack Kennedy" and Kamala Harris's "That little girl was me." Law schools now use the video as a teaching tool for both constitutional analysis and effective argumentation. For viewers who witnessed it live, the moment Jasmine Crockett methodically exposed Alan Dershowitz's constitutional contradictions became a reference point in American political discourse. The day when preparation, principles, and persistence triumphed over prominence, privilege, and pretense. The confrontation revealed something beyond the specific constitutional questions at issue. It demonstrated that in the battle of ideas, intellectual integrity matters more than academic pedigree or media profile. It showed that even the most established figures can be held accountable by those armed with facts, focus, and fearlessness. Most importantly, it reminded Americans that the Constitution isn't just the domain of elite legal scholars, but belongs to all citizens willing to engage seriously with its principles and protect its promises. As Crockett herself said in a later interview, "I didn't shut down Professor Dershowitz, the Constitution did." If you found this breakdown of this epic constitutional showdown valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most important political confrontations with in-depth analysis you won't find anywhere else. Comment below with your thoughts on who had the stronger constitutional argument, and share this video with anyone who appreciates seeing powerful figures held accountable to their own words.